crisp morning air filled my lungs as I stepped onto my back porch, rifle in hand. I'd been looking forward to this opening day of deer season for months. My property bordered a dense stretch of woods where a well-known buck had been grazing near the tree line all summer. The best part? That section of forest technically belonged to me. At least the first 30 yards past my survey markers did. I settled into my tree stand before dawn, thermos of coffee steaming beside me. Right on schedule, the massive 10-point buck emerged. At first light. One clean shot later, and I was hauling my prize back toward the house to field dress it. That's when I heard the shrill voice. "Mark Dawson! What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Linda Carmichael, the HOA president, stood at the edge of my property in her ridiculous gardening hat, face twisted in disgust. Her little Yorkshire Terrier yapped hysterically at the blood trail I was leaving across the frost-covered grass. "Harvesting my deer, Linda," I said, not breaking stride. "Just like I do every November." "That is disgusting." She wrinkled her nose dramatically. "And you were shooting a gun. Do you have any idea how many children live in this neighborhood?" I rolled my eyes. "It's 5:30 in the morning on a Saturday. Besides, I'm well within my property lines and following all county ordinances." The next morning, an official HOA violation notice waited in my mailbox. 2 citations, $250 for disruptive discharge of firearms, and another $250 for maintenance. Violations. Bloodstains on lawn creating unsightly conditions. The letter stated I had 7 days to pay or face additional late fees and potential liens against my property. I stormed down to the HOA office, slamming the notice on the reception desk. Linda emerged from her office with that infuriating smug smile, flanked by 2 other board members. "This is ridiculous," I said through gritted teeth. "I was hunting on my own property, which is perfectly legal. The blood washed away with a garden hose." Linda adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Dawson, Pine Ridge Estates is a family community. Your hobby creates an atmosphere of violence and disorder. The board has received multiple complaints." "From who?" "The only person who saw me was you." She ignored me, tapping the violation letter. "The fines stand. And I'll remind you that continued violations could result in suspension of your community privileges." "What privileges? The overpriced pool that's never open when I want to use it? The tennis courts with the broken net?" Linda's smile didn't waver. "The nature trails, for one. I'd hate to see you lose access over something so preventable." That's when I realized this wasn't about hunting at all. This was Linda flexing her petty HOA power because she could. As I left the office, a new determination settled over me. If they wanted to play hardball over a few bloodstains on the grass, I'd show them what a real property dispute looked like. The wheels started turning in my head as I walked past the Pine Ridge Nature Trails sign on my way home. Those trails were the crown jewel of the neighborhood, the one amenity everyone actually used. And suddenly, I had an idea. A beautiful, terrible idea. First, I needed to do some research. But if my hunch was correct, Linda and her little HOA dictatorship were about to get the wake-up call of their lives. I allowed myself a small smile as I pulled out my phone and dialed my real estate attorney. The game was on. The HOA office door hadn't even fully closed behind me when I pulled out my phone and called my old college roommate, Jake Reynolds. He'd been a real estate attorney in the city for 15 years and loved nothing more than sticking it to bureaucratic bullies. "Let me get this straight," Jake said through muffled crunching sounds, probably demolishing his 3rd bag of pretzels before noon. "They fined you for hunting on your own property and threatened to revoke your access to community trails?" "Yep. And I'm pretty sure Linda pulled the multiple complaints thing out of her ass. Nobody else has ever said a word to me about it." Jake snorted. "Classic HOA power trip. But here's the thing. Most of these neighborhood associations don't actually own the land for their so-called amenities. They usually lease it or have some kind of shared agreement. You might have an angle here." That night, I spread out the Pine Ridge Estates property maps across my kitchen table, the ones I'd dug up from the county records office. Sure enough, the 50-acre wooded area with the hiking trails, the one the HOA brochures bragged about as an exclusive resident benefit, wasn't part of the association's holdings. The parcel was listed under Hendricks Family Trust. I remembered old man Hendricks from when I first moved in. Gruff, no-nonsense type who'd sold most of his farmland to developers but kept a few choice plots. According to the records, the HOA had been leasing the trail land from him on a 10-year agreement. The next morning, I drove out to Hendricks' remaining farmhouse on the edge of town. The place looked more weathered than I remembered, paint peeling on the wraparound porch. Hendricks himself answered the door in worn overalls, squinting at me through thick glasses. "Dawson, right? From Pine Ridge?" He didn't sound thrilled. "To see me?" "Yes, sir. I was hoping we could talk about your land agreement with the HOA. His bushy eyebrows shot up. "That's so? Come on in then. This ought to be good." The inside smelled like coffee and old wood. Hendricks poured us both mugs from a percolator that looked older than I was before getting down to business. "Those HOA bastards," he grumbled, slamming his mug down hard enough to slosh coffee onto the table. "Been nickel and diming me for years. Wanted me to pay for trail maintenance last year when the lease clearly states that's their responsibility. Then they had the nerve to be late with last quarter's payment." I leaned forward. "What if you didn't have to deal with them anymore?" Hendricks's eyes narrowed. "Meaning?" "Meaning I'd like to buy that parcel from you. Cash offer, no contingencies." The old man let out a wheezing laugh. "Boy, you got a grudge or something? Let's just say Linda Carmichael and I have different ideas about property rights." Hendricks studied me for a long moment, then shuffled over to an ancient filing cabinet. He pulled out a folder thick with papers. "Current lease has 3 years left. But there's a clause. If ownership changes hands, the HOA has first right of refusal to match any offer." He smirked. "Of course, they'd have to be notified properly." I felt the pieces clicking into place. How much would it take to make this worth your while? Hendricks named a figure that made my stomach clench. Nearly my entire liquid savings. But then he added, "I'll throw in the adjacent 2 acres too. That way when you inevitably piss off the HOA, you've got some buffer land to play with." I extended my hand. "You've got yourself a deal." As I drove home, my mind raced with possibilities. The HOA had no idea what was coming. Linda's precious nature trails, the one amenity that actually gave the neighborhood its premium status, were about to become my personal bargaining chip. First thing tomorrow, I'd call Jake to draw up the paperwork. Then the real fun would begin. I glanced at the HOA violation notice still taped to my fridge and smiled. Payback was going to be sweeter than I'd imagined. The paperwork took longer than expected. 3 weeks of back and forth with Hendricks's lawyer about mineral rights and easements that neither of us actually cared about. But finally, on a rainy Tuesday morning, I stood in the county clerk's office watching the notary stamp the final documents. The Hendricks Family Trust's 52 acres were officially mine. I waited until Friday afternoon to make my move, timing it so the HOA office would receive my notice right before closing. Let them stew over the weekend. The letter was beautifully simple. Pursuant to Section 12.3 of the existing land lease agreement, notice is hereby given that ownership of parcel 1147B, including all hiking trails and associated amenities, has transferred as of this date. Per terms of the lease, the HOA has 30 days to exercise its right of first refusal by matching the purchase price of $1.2 million. I included a copy of the recorded deed for maximum effect. The call came before I'd even pulled out of the UPS store parking lot. Linda's voice was shrill enough to make me hold the phone away from my ear. "Mark Dawson, what is this nonsense? You can't just buy community property." I put on my best innocent tone. "Community property? According to the county records, I just bought private land from Mr. Hendricks. The trails just happened to be on it." There was a long silence. When she spoke again, her voice had that dangerous calm that meant she was barely containing her rage. "The board will be calling an emergency meeting." "Looking forward to it," I said cheerfully before hanging up. The meeting notice arrived via email 2 hours later, Sunday at 3 p.m. at the clubhouse. The subject line read, "Urgent Community Land Crisis." I chuckled at the dramatics. Sunday arrived with perfect irony. One of those golden autumn afternoons where half the neighborhood was out enjoying the very trails I now owned. I arrived at the clubhouse 10 minutes late on purpose. The place was packed. Not just the usual busybody retirees, but young families too. A buzz of nervous conversation died as I walked in. Linda stood at the front beside a projector screen, showing a zoomed-in property map. Her face flushed when she saw me. "Mr. Dawson, how convenient of you to join us." I took a seat in the front row, stretching my legs out comfortably. Wouldn't miss it. She cleared her throat. As I was explaining, "Before we were interrupted, there appears to be a misunderstanding regarding our nature trails. Mr. Dawson has..."
Linda banged her gavel. "This is highly inappropriate. The board will what?" I pulled a folded document from my jacket. "I have the deed right here. The lease gives you 30 days to match my offer, unless you've got $1.2 million in petty cash." The room erupted. Linda's gavel banging was drowned out by shouts of protest. I waited for the chaos to peak before dropping my bombshell. Effective immediately, the trails are closed for safety inspections. I smirked at Linda's horrified expression. Permanently, as I walked out. The uproar followed me into the parking lot. My phone started buzzing with texts from neighbors, some furious, others secretly thrilled to see the HOA taken down a peg. I ignored them all. Tomorrow I'd have fencing crews out. They're installing gates and no trespassing signs. Maybe in a few weeks after Linda had properly sweated, I'd consider reopening the trails, with some new rules, of course. For now, I drove home smiling, watching in my rearview mirror as the crowd spilled out of the clubhouse, still arguing. The hunting fine notice was still taped to my fridge. I took it down and slipped it into the shredder. The first private property, no trespassing signs went up at dawn on Monday. I'd hired a crew to install heavy-duty steel gates at every trailhead overnight, ensuring the HOA board members would arrive at their morning power walks to an unpleasant surprise. By 7:30 a.m., my phone was blowing up with notifications. I let the calls go to voicemail until Linda's 12th attempt. When I finally answered, her voice was razor-sharp. "Mark, this has gone far enough. The board demands an emergency meeting." Demands. I chuckled, sipping my coffee on the back porch. "Linda, you're not in a position to demand anything. But I'll tell you what. I'll meet you at the main trailhead in an hour. Bring the whole board." The scene when I arrived could have been featured on the local news. A crowd of at least 50 residents had gathered, some still in their workout clothes, others clutching leashes of confused dogs. The newly installed gate gleamed in the morning sun, its heavy chain and padlock impossible to miss. Linda stood at the front with the rest of the HOA board, their faces varying shades of purple. Camera phones clicked as I approached. Linda stepped forward, her voice dripping with faux diplomacy. "Mark, surely we can discuss this like reasonable adults. The trails are a vital part of our community, just like hunting is a vital part of my family traditions," I interrupted. "But that didn't stop you from slapping me with bogus fines, did it?" A murmur ran through the crowd. A guy in the back, one of the few neighbors who'd ever complimented my venison jerky, shouted, "He's got a point." Linda's eye twitched. "That was a separate issue. This is about power," I finished for her. "Your power trip, to be exact." I pulled out a folded document from my back pocket. "This is the new trail use agreement, short version. The trails reopen today, but only for residents who aren't on the HOA board." The crowd erupted. Linda looked like she might actually combust. "You can't do that." "I can, and I did." I held up the property deed. "My land, my rules. Same way you thought my backyard was your jurisdiction when it suited you." A woman pushed to the front, Mrs. Peterson, whose kids I'd helped when their bike tires went flat last summer. "What do you want, Mark?" I met Linda's glare. "3 things. 1, all my fines disappear. 2, a public apology from the board for overstepping their authority. 3, I paused for effect. Linda resigns as HOA president. The gasps were audible. Linda's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Board member Greg Thompson, who'd always been the least terrible of the bunch, stepped forward. "Mark, be reasonable. We can reverse the fines, but forcing someone to resign Is exactly the kind of petty power move the HOA specializes in, I said. Difference is, this time I've actually got the deed to back it up. The crowd's energy shifted palpably. People who'd been glaring at me were now shooting dirty looks at Linda. A teenage boy whose family I knew quietly cheered. Linda found her voice again. This is blackmail. No, Linda, I said, unlocking the gate with an exaggerated flourish. This is consequences. I turned to the crowd. Trails are open for everyone except current board members, at least until we reach an agreement. As I walked away, the sound of the crowd pouring through the gates behind me was sweeter than any victory could be. Linda's shrill protests were drowned out by the chatter of neighbors happily reclaiming their walking paths. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake, my lawyer. Heard the coup was successful. Drinks later? I glanced back at the chaos I'd unleashed. The HOA board huddled together like a defeated sports team. The trail's alive with people again. I typed back, make it a double. This might just be the start. By the time I got home, 3 separate neighbors had dropped off baked goods as thank yous. The hunting fine notice was still in the shredder where it belonged. And best of all, from my kitchen window I had a perfect view of Linda Carmichael pacing her driveway, phone pressed to her ear, looking more unraveled than I'd ever seen her. Revenge, I decided as I bit into a still warm chocolate chip cookie. Never tasted so sweet. This response is AI generated, for reference only. The HOA board folded faster than a cheap lawn chair. By Wednesday morning, an official notice appeared in every Pine Ridge Estates mailbox. All fines against me were rescinded, and a carefully worded apology for any misunderstandings regarding property rights was printed in bold. But the real victory came when Linda's resignation letter hit the community Facebook page that evening. I was grilling venison steaks from last season's freezer stash just to rub it in, when Greg Thompson showed up at my doorstep looking like a man who'd aged 10 years in 3 days. Board voted unanimously to accept your terms, he said, shifting uncomfortably on my welcome mat. Trails reopen to everyone tomorrow? I flipped a steak, letting the aroma waft between us, with one addition. I pulled out a sheet of paper, my newly drafted Pine Ridge Trail Usage Agreement. Greg's eyes widened as he read the terms. No HOA fines for legal hunting activities on private property. Annual resident vote on board members. And my personal favorite, a permanent seat on the Architectural Review Committee for the landowner. That'd be me. You're kidding, Greg groaned. I handed him a pen. Sign here or the gates stay locked. By Friday, the trails were officially reopened, the new rules posted at every entrance. The neighborhood's reaction was interesting. The anti-hunting crowd grumbled, but most residents seemed relieved the drama was over. Several even thanked me for shaking things up. On Saturday morning, I returned to my tree stand for the first time since this whole mess began. The crisp air felt different now, cleaner somehow. Mid-morning, a text came through from Mrs. Peterson. Saw your buck from my kitchen window. Nice shot. Bring us some jerky when it's ready. I was packing up my gear when movement caught my eye. Linda Carmichael stood at the edge of my property line, arms crossed. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away. The following month, the newly elected HOA board, now including 2 residents who'd supported me during the trail closure, held their first meeting. I attended as a courtesy, smirking when they tabled a motion to review noise ordinance language regarding outdoor activities. As winter set in, an unexpected thing happened. The neighborhood actually improved. Fewer petty violations, more block parties. Greg even asked me for hunting tips after tasting my smoked venison at the holiday potluck. Come spring, I donated a bench for the trails, positioned perfectly to overlook the stretch of woods where that 10-point buck liked to graze. The plaque read, "In memory of reasonable property rights." Linda moved out in June. The for sale sign went up the same week the county paper ran a story about unusually harmonious HOA relations in Pine Ridge Estates. I still hunt every season, still process my deer in the backyard. And now, not a single complaint. Sometimes justice doesn't just come served cold. It comes with a side of perfectly seasoned victory. As I sit on that bench watching the sunset through the trees, the sounds of families hiking and biking on the trails behind me, I can't help but smile. The HOA tried to fine me out of my traditions, so I bought the land under their feet instead. Best $1.2 million I ever spent.